Hello and welcome everyone. So in this video I'm going to talk about agriculture in the developing world and some applications of behavioral economics, especially around the idea of technology diffusion and technology adoption. And then I'll think about the role of information in that paper there. So I'm not going to make a video of the videos, but other things equal, like I sort of intend for you to click through and then watch the videos to motivate each of the lectures. And then wherever I've got those interspersed in the lecture as well. Are where I just don't want to not going to make the video longer than it has to be to show another video. So anyway, all right. So this is going to be the reference for the first paper here that I'll discuss. This right here, these two actually jointly are the references for the collection of papers that I'll discuss. Fourth. So nudging farmers to use fertilizer, theory and experimental evidence from Kenya. This one is looking at information, especially relevant to soy markets in India, and with really important impacts on market efficiency. And then, this one's the pineapple paper. That's this one right here, thinking about learning from demonstration and then from neighbors. And then there's a couple others that I sort of integrate into the discussion at various points. All right, so the first thing is realizing that there's been relatively low agricultural productivity and rates of diffusion of agricultural technology in Africa relative to other parts of the world. And so actually the recommendation is then going to be, well, let's focus on information, right? So let's focus on information. Let's focus on the flow of knowledge regarding uptake of improved ways to cultivate crops. All right, so the evidence that they've got comes from World Development Report. And so they've got their images that I have in the video as well. So this is looking at the expansion of cereal production. So we have sub-Saharan Africa, actually is in orange, and then this green here is Asia. We see, oh wow, the crops are being much more efficient in Asia. Actually, I've got some of the later figures show kind of some insight into why that would be the case. In Africa, it looks like there's more area in crops, but less productivity. Or lower growth in yields. And so there's some interesting stories. You could tell a lot of stories about why that could be the case. I mean, maybe if we're expanding how much is devoted to a particular crop, maybe the new land that's going to be cultivated isn't going to be as desirable as the previous land. Otherwise, it would have already been, right? Otherwise, it would have already been in the crop. But it's hard to say. So anyway, this is at least suggestive, right, of there being kind of like a big difference. Well, it definitely demonstrates there's a big difference between what's happened in Asia and in Africa. All right, so this is looking at growth in agricultural GDP per agricultural population. GDP per population is like GDP per capita. And so this is showing, so it's lowest in sub-Saharan Africa. We're looking at the orange bar, right? Agricultural GDP is just the green. We see actually, right, agricultural GDP, it's not the lowest, right? It's higher than in Latin America and Caribbean. And so this is speaking to the fact that, if we are expanding agriculture, we're hopefully going to expand the market value of the goods produced, even if productivity is not, your yields aren't rising at the same rate. All right, so this is looking at the uptake of things like irrigation. And then the next one is going to be, I think, improved cereals and then fertilizer. So for irrigation, we see, oh, wow. I mean, irrigation has been greatly expanded from, this is 1962, 1982 to 2002 across South Asia. And then kind of indeed lag behind in sub-Saharan Africa. 1962 seems to me like could have been forever ago. 1982 probably feels to you or to most of my students like that was forever ago. Although, I graduated from high school with a lot of people who were born in 1982. And I'm older than that. So anyway, all right. So sub-Saharan Africa is lagging behind in improved varieties of cereals. However, this is suggestive of a massive increase in uptake, kind of relatively more recently, right? So you see this is looking at, I think that was I can hardly, 1980. All right. So 1980, way behind. But then it looks like, considerable expansion. And so relatively recently. And so actually be interesting now to get the updated data. See what it looks like now 2 decades later. but I wasn't able to find that, at least for the purposes of this here. But anyway, so this sort of establishes the trend that we're working in. This isn't all right. Sorry. If I zoom in and then I try to use my dial on my mouse to be able to click between the slides, it doesn't work as well. So then here's fertilizer usage. Wow. So this is a lot lower, right, in sub-Saharan Africa than the rest of the world. Okay. So this is sort of suggestive of a number of things. Firstly, there's sort of room for gains and room for improvement, and we see this, right? So this last thing now is showing the exploitable yield gaps for maize in Africa, and this is showing the difference between the average national yield, right? Average national yield, and then average yield in farm demonstrations. Now, this is interesting. So the farm demonstrations, hopefully, are going to be relatively representative of what the farmers actually could be able to produce. You might worry a little bit that the demonstration farms are going to be like under the most ideal conditions, but hopefully they're under the most ideal conditions that actual farmers could easily attain. And I don't know enough about the conditions and circumstances to know if that was true. Actually, my research is interested in looking at farm demonstrations and experiments that were taking place on ordinary farmers' plots throughout the state and throughout the province of Ontario, for a variety of reasons. Firstly, to help the researchers see, is this actually attainable at other places in the state? And then secondly, to help farmers locally, get exposure to what's the knowledge that's being generated at the university. Anyway, so this is at least suggestive that, exploitable yield gaps are high for Africa. Okay, so now I take a break, and now I want to talk about the role of information. And then I'll come back to, so we're going to go to India. Now we'll talk about information, then we'll come back and we'll go to Africa. All right, so here is the clip that I would typically show. And so this kind of does an overview. The audio's not great, but it's not great in the sense of like it's hard to hear, but it's interesting in terms of like giving sort of an overview of how these things that I'm now going to discuss work. I wonder if this might have been like a class project or something. But anyway, so it's really interesting. Yeah, you could see like obviously like you could see my study music, and then you can see my Pat McAfee show. So I like Aaron Rodgers Tuesdays. So anyway. Right. So in developing countries, farmers produce cash crops that are often exploited by intermediaries. So the idea, and we see this a little bit with fair trade, is that you've got the farmers who are producing the crop, but they're not selling directly to the buyers that are then going to bring it to the market. They're selling it to someone in the middle who's going to turn around and then sell it to the buyers that go to the market. And one of the issues is that these intermediaries tend to have monopsony power. Monopsony power means that they're a single buyer of the product because of high transportation costs, high transaction costs, lack of information, right? Lack of pricing information, and then inability to verify quality. And this is bad because, so you could think of if there's no way for farmers or for the buyer, the intermediary, to verify quality, probably things are going to go against the favor of the farmer, right? Probably it's going to go in favor of the intermediary, who's going to probably quote and then deliver a lower price than would match the quality. All right, so here's a figure depicting the significance of the soy market, and this is, I think this is for the particular region. This isn't. So wait. So this is, and then again. Here I thought it would lock, so I wouldn't be able to skip through using my... Anyway, so this has the western region, and this has the eastern region, and this has like the relevant crops. So it's saying, soy there's a substantial share of the acreage under soy in the western region. All right, so here's the setting. We're looking at a particular central Indian state. Now, farmers are selling their produce to traders in government-regulated wholesale markets. And the idea was actually that this is supposed to be good for the farmers. This is supposed to be an improvement beyond what had previously been taking place. what happens then is the traders then turn around and they sell the produce to companies that process and or bring it to ultimately bring it to the market. And there's a lot. There's maybe 250, at least at the time of writing, of these such wholesale markets. Now, the way that the trades would take place is we'd expect this sort of oral ascending bid auction, not action, auction. So an oral ascending bid auction is just like oral means everybody's calling out their bids, and then ascending means start low and then it goes higher, right? All right, so the government official first inspects the produce, then sets the initial bid, and then bids should rise, at least in theory, until the crop is ultimately sold for the given quality and for the given produce that the farmer's selling. And like I said, these were initially established, at least for the benefit of farmers, was the story. In particular, this auction mechanism was suggested as a way to kind of influence or mitigate the influence of traders, right? So firstly, the fact that it's open and oral, everybody hears the bids. There's this kind of restores some of the information, and then it's ascending, and so rather than setting a particular price that's then imposed on the buyers, you've got at least in principle, the price that they're getting could be rising, all right, as the traders are bidding with each other. What's the problem? Well, it's a relatively small number of traders. They can organize, they can collude, and then ultimately they're going to increase buyer surplus at the expense of farmer surplus, right? By maintaining relatively low bids, right? Maybe in principle or in practice having some type of ceiling that they wouldn't bid above. Okay, so the big problem, the larger context is there's issue of asymmetric information, right? So the traders, well, they have way better knowledge of the prevailing prices across the different markets. And, well, also then there's the transaction costs of going from one market to another makes it kind of prohibitively difficult for farmers to want to kind of move their crops and shop around. Ideally, for the markets for this process to work well, you'd need to have symmetric information. Farmers would have to have actually direct access to the processors. You wouldn't have the intermediary in the first place. Also, if the farmers had a better price signal, they'd know how to optimize their planting decisions and then how they're allocating land, right? If they could trust the price signal, then they could trust the message about whether or not they should be increasing or reducing the amount of soy that they're producing. So anyway, this is kind of like a lot of inefficiencies, and some of the inefficiency is going to lead towards like inefficient allocation of the resources that are then going into this crop. So there's sort of bad effects kind of all around. All right, so what this paper is doing is studying this particular introduction of technology to restore the information balance. In particular, these kiosks that help facilitate transactions in the soy market. And I think this is really cool. So in October of 2000, ITC Limited, so one of the large soybean buyers, decides kind of unilaterally to try to eliminate the intermediaries. And what they did is they had these kiosks, these internet kiosks that enabled farmers to access the daily wholesale prices and then warehouses, which would allow them to test for quality and then match it up with whatever would be the price for the quality of whatever they were able to sell. Also, these hubs facilitated direct sales between the farmers and the company. So this is important for actually kind of a lot of reasons. Firstly, at least in principle, this is restoring a lot of information to the farmers so that they have more knowledge now about what's the daily price of whatever it is that they're trying to sell, and rather than just relying on the intermediary to set the price or to bid on the price and maybe fail to bid up the price. All right, so basically what ends up happening is the farmers are now able to compare. They're able to look and see what's going to be the price offered by ITC and then what's going to be the price offered at the wholesale market. So the important thing now is that farmers have improved bargaining power, right? Because now they've got an outside option. They're not forced to sell at the wholesale market. They've got someplace else. They've got another buyer. This undermines some of the monopsony power of the wholesale markets. So this was actually good for farmers. This is also good for ITC because now, there's something in it for them as well. Besides now having access to a lot of sellers that are interested in considering them, they've also got an ability to screen the quality without relying on going through the government officials and the wholesale markets, the intermediaries. What ended up happening? Well, by 2004, something like 4% of soy production was sold to ITC directly, where the kiosks and hubs were available. So they were able to get a number of direct buys. All right, so what's happened? Well, this sort of improvement in the information, the pricing information available to farmers by virtue of these kiosks, ultimately, as I mentioned, reduces the monopsony power. Other things equal, we should expect this would raise the price sold at the wholesale markets. Remember, so like if you have a monopoly, you've got a single seller, and then we'd expect the price to be we'd expect the price to be high. That's bad for the buyer. That's good for the seller. With the monopsony power, we'd expect there's a single buyer, and what this buyer wants to do is drive the price down and make it lower. So that's bad for the seller. That's bad for the farmer. Now, if the monopsony power is eroded, we expect the price to rise. That's good for the farmer that's selling it to the intermediary that's buying the soy. All right, so there's two opposing forces that we might think of, and then the paper is going to kind of think about whether the competition or composition effect is going to be stronger. So the two forces. Well, the direct buying by ITC is going to divert sales from the wholesale markets, which by virtue of reducing the quantity available should drive up the price just by law of demand. And then scientific testing, well, might have this sort of self-selection effect. So there might be lower prices at these wholesale markets by virtue of, well, maybe the better quality goes to ITC, the worse quality goes to wholesale. And the lower quality would tend towards prices falling. All right, so we've got these two effects. What actually happens? Well, they find, significant increase in the monthly price of soybeans of somewhere in the order between 1% to 3% after the kiosks are introduced. Right, so prices are rising, which suggests that the monopsony power is being eroded. Also, evidence suggests an increase in the area under soy cultivation due to the intervention, which basically means that here farmers are now sort of reacting to the signal, which is saying, oh, well, if we're getting paid more, it makes sense to produce more, right? So if the price is rising, we'd expect suppliers to increase the quantity available in the market. All right, so further, the results suggest that there's net welfare gains to the soy farmers. So meaning that there's an increase in efficiency, and in particular that some of the beneficiaries of this increased efficiency were the farmers. Also, ITC gains by reducing transaction costs and improving their efficiency in terms of procurement efficiency means like what are all the costs that go into obtaining the soy from the farmers for ITC? Well, it's going to be lower now because you've got farmers who are willing to come and bring their soy directly to ITC to check, firstly, the price, also the quality, and so on and so forth. And then as a result, the traders seem to be losing some of their monopsony power. Here's just their results. This is just the empirical results. We see, price is going to be higher where there's a kiosk. And then we see the effect on crop output. There's going to be, an increase in production of soy. It looks like a little bit of a negative impact on rice. I don't know. It seems odd. I don't know enough about soy and rice, but it seems odd that you think of these being highly linked. It could just be an oddity of the data that you think of. So the story that you might be tempted to tell is that farmers are taking land out of rice and into soy. That doesn't seem to make sense. All right, so that last paper talks about the role of information in improving efficiency in the functioning of markets and in affecting the bargaining power for farmers and reducing the monopsony power for the buyers. All right, so the next thing I want to do, so that was this paper's thinking about information generally through the specific example of soy. Now I want to think about the diffusion of technology, and in particular learning, dealing with specifically pineapples in Kenya. And so kind of take a look at the video. So let's see. So the video is going to look at, I want to show the first part about pineapples. So this is what pineapples are, right? So I had thought pineapples would be like on a tree or something. No. Pineapples grow on the ground. Look at this. This is great. So here are the pineapples in rows on the ground. I don't know. I thought I guess I'd confuse pineapples with bananas or something. But anyway, so here they're talking about pineapple farming. And there's an interesting story from the fellow that's featured in the video about their own kind of decisions to get into farming pineapple. All right, so what they're doing in this particular paper here is thinking about the role of learning. In particular, thinking about what people are learning from their neighbors relative to pineapple farming. The important thing, so I don't want to get ahead of myself, what they're really interested in doing is the role of social learning and the patterns for the diffusion of non-biological innovation through networks of pineapple farmers in Ghana. All right, so the interesting thing, though, is that this is an area where it requires substantial learning, in particular thinking about how to grow pineapples and how to adopt fertilizer. I mentioned in this video from the fellow from Kenya talking about the decision to decide to produce pineapples. All right, so here's the issue. Well, the region had an established system growing other crops. It was recently transformed into pineapple for export to European markets. And so what's happened now is the farmers have to adapt a new set of cultivation methods. They have to think about, like, well, how do you grow pineapple? And then what's the fertilizer? What's the other chemicals? What's the other treatment? How do you actually have to cultivate pineapple? Because it's going to differ from the other things that they'd previously been producing. All right, so how does this process of learning occur? And then what are the factors that are relevant? All right, so the authors are going to think about geographic and informational relationships between farmers. So where are they physically located? Also, who do they know? And then think about what's happening over time to look at subsequent choices. So what they're really interested in is the effect on one farmer's experience on the behavior of others. I think that's really cool. It's kind of a really cool thing to look at. What do they find? Well, inexperienced farmers are more responsive to the success and failures of others. Farmers tend to mimic the practices of neighbors who display surprisingly favorable results in the sense of exceeding expected profits. Well, people are trying to profit, right? So if somebody does surprisingly profitable, that's who you're going to copy, right? And so that's kind of what's happening. Farmers change from their current fertilizer level to respond to the experience of their neighbors, placing weight on whether the experience was from somebody using a similar or dissimilar level of fertilizer as oneself. Right? So somebody had a really favorable experience, that would really matter. And so firstly, is it a positive or negative experience I'm observing from my neighbor? Well, farmers are more likely to adjust their usage after observing the bad experience of neighbors with their previous level. So if whatever is my level of fertilizer, if I see this has gone poorly from my neighbor, then I'm really interested in doing something different. Farmers are less likely to change when the observation concerns higher or lower levels of fertilizer usage than they employ themselves. So if I see my neighbor have a bad result, but they're doing something different with fertilizer, I'm going to attribute it to that difference. Ultimately, the evidence that they're finding suggests, well, social learning is important in these communities. Information has value, as do the literal network connections that are facilitating the flow of information. So it matters what the information is, and it matters how it's reaching you. Speed of information transmission depends on the value of the information to each farmer and the cost of forming information links, right? And then they think about the things that might be relevant to the social structure of the village, so religion, wealth, family ties, and so on and so forth. And then they're looking to see what's relevant for the diffusion of information. And that's really interesting. I mean, the idea of like people learning and then being able to observe and then discuss with neighbors and then having that influence their own behavior. I mean, we could think about this you could think about this with like product reviews or something like that, right? So it's not, I mean, humans are humans. And so we see kind of the same sort of social learning happening in a lot of different cases. Here just happens to be with pineapples. All right, so in this series of papers now, we're looking at a collection of observations about behavior, specifically, typically around fertilizer with farmers. And so one of the big questions for this series of papers is, why are farmers not using fertilizer? All right, so there's actually kind of a lot of reasons why this could be the case, and even more besides what I've reflected here. But so there's a series of hypotheses you might be interested in if we notice low fertilizer uptake. Matter of fact, we saw that from the table that I showed earlier. So could be a variety of reasons. Could be fertilizer simply not profitable in the actual conditions in the farmer's field, meaning like maybe it's profitable, maybe it's fine for the experiment station or for the demonstration plot, but when you get to my land, it's actually not good for me particularly. That could be it, or specifically. Could be farmers could profit from fertilizer, but they don't either know the extent to which it'll be profitable, like how profitable it would be, or they don't know how to properly use it, so they or don't want to bother with it because they're worried that it's just going to be a waste. All right, and then another issue could be farmers have difficulty financing the investment. It could be that they're not able to save, or it could be, other issues like they're able to save, but then they don't have access to it, or there's mistrust about if I save, will I be able to buy the fertilizer? I think some of the more recent research is thinking about the fact that farmers have a problem where they're simply not able to access the fertilizer at the time that they need it, and so since they don't have access to it when they need it and or aren't able to store it or whatever, then it ends up not getting used. All right, in terms of the findings from that paper, well, they reinforce the idea that fertilizer is profitable. Providing information goes part of the way towards increasing adoption, right? Letting farmers know that fertilizer is going to be really profitable. Programs that help farmers commit at the point where they have money to use fertilizer in the future has a very large impact on adoption. But I think if I remember this program correctly, what happened was farmers could pay for a voucher, and then the fertilizer would be delivered to them at the time of planting, and that was really useful in terms of increasing adoption. So what were they doing to investigate this? So they selected farmers from parents of school children in the area. They measured 3 adjacent 30-meter plots for each farmer, randomly selected one of the 3 plots to apply fertilizer, and then hybrid seed, and one with only top dressing when the plant's knee-high, and then one as a comparison plot. And so what they did is they had these 3 to look at, and they were able to show, indeed, the one that got the fertilizer and the one that was cultivated properly had the highest yield, right? The program was continued for 4 growing seasons, though they ultimately discontinued the use of the hybrid seeds. The results suggested the use of fertilizer is, by the Ministry of Agriculture, is riskier and less profitable on average than just the top dressing. And then confusion in farmers as to how much to use seemed to be a problem. So, all right. So it turned out that top dressing was the better route, and then there's confusion amongst farmers about how to make that work. All right, so after each pilot, they followed the farmers to see if they chose to use fertilizer in subsequent seasons. Participants increased participation by 17 percentage points from a basis of 20% in the control, and then the effect arose over time down to near 10% 3 seasons later. That's interesting. So people start off doing the being interested in using fertilizer, but then later on kind of stopped. In terms of further investigating the learning dynamic, they randomly selected friends of the farmers in the experiment to attend the key periods of the demonstration, right, to kind of gather the information, be useful kind of at the right time. Attending the demonstration seems to be as effective as being the main farmer for the trials, and this effect persists into the next season, right? So seeing was believing in this case. All right. In terms of how this proceeded, they randomly selected farmers in other schools to receive a small quantity of seeds in their fertilizer starter kit. They're told how to use the kit and then not monitored. The results suggested that the opportunity to try out the fertilizer and seeds influenced future adoption if they're able to try it. You could think of a lot of reasons why that would be the case. Firstly, here I'm getting a kit for free that I can kind of play around with, and if it doesn't work, I'm only out my time and whatever land and resources were devoted to the trial. Whereas, if you're going to buy fertilizer and then try it out, there's a much bigger potential risk and then cost. They also tested whether the mechanism was simply the endorsement of fertilizer use. So they gave a speech to advocate the use and reiterated the government recommendations that they had conducted trials in the area with good results. And this effort was associated with a modest positive but insignificant effect. It's interesting. I have a research paper that looks at this kind of flow of information from a recommendation from a university agronomist to farmers. But anyway, so let's see. So then in this other paper, they're observing farmers joining the demonstration plots. 11% more likely to use fertilizer the next season. The effect wanes over time, as we saw. As regards adoption, the effect of being invited to watch a demonstration is as large as doing the experiment oneself. Talked about that. They don't find evidence of social learning, but note that a program to buy fertilizer at harvest time has a bigger effect than a 50% subsidy later on. Oh, that's really interesting, right? So this is talking about, remember we said what was really effective was if people could buy this voucher and then they were able to buy the fertilizer and then it'd be delivered at harvest time. That was better than giving them the 50% subsidy in the future. Why? Because I think the problem was they weren't able to have access, and or here they're talking about the barrier to save as being an issue. I think actually I'm remembering further research suggesting that I don't know if that was 100% the story. But what they did do that was effective was they created the Savings and Fertilizer Initiative. So indeed provided a commitment device to farmers wanting to subsequently use fertilizer at some point in the future. And this was their voucher program, right? The farmer visited right after harvest was offered the option to purchase a voucher for fertilizer. ICS then distributes the fertilizer at the time of planting, right? And that turned out to be useful. All right, and then this last one from the series of papers, they studied subsistence maize farmers in Western Kenya, created and tested a model with randomized field experiment, and found that farmers' behavior is consistent with present bias preferences. The results suggest these issues can be remedied by small time limited discounts around harvest rather than subsidies near planting season. So interesting. They found that it was better to discount around harvest when people had the money available than to give subsidies at the time when planting was near. Found that farmers report their reasons for not using fertilizer is, well, insufficient funds to purchase, but then observe even poor farmers had the resources at the time of harvest, but tend not to save. And it's interesting thinking about like why they're not able to save. Could be just like all humans, maybe a self-control problem. Could also be that there's a lack of good financial institutions that make saving practical. And so that's kind of another issue. Results consistent with the belief that when faced with small fixed costs of purchasing fertilizer, farmers exhibit present bias and procrastinate, failing to take advantage of profitable investments. They respond to time-limited discounts on fertilizer on harvest time in a manner that makes this more effective than interventions nearer to planting. And while this is consistent with this idea of present bias, of course, it's also consistent with realizing that maybe saving is characterized by quite a bit of uncertainty if there's uncertainty around the financial system. All right, so then a series of other kind of related literature I just mentioned really quickly. So this paper notes the limited adoption of available improved varieties in Uganda and estimates or examines the factors affecting the diffusion of agricultural technology. They show that there's peer effects regarding the use of improved varieties within the community as an important factor for adoption. Farmers' existing knowledge of improved varieties shown to be an important factor associated with higher adoption rates, right? So now they're thinking about improved varieties as like what's the high yielding version of, pineapple or maize or whatever is the case. And so try to get farmers to adopt and to plant the improved variety and procure the seed to be able to do so. And so they're finding all the things that are relevant, in particular, different types of knowledge that are useful for getting people to adopt. This other paper is looking at the adoption of seed and fertilizer, and they find extension services, on-farm field trials, variety characteristics, and rainfall average are the most important factors for the uptake of improved varieties, right? So the things that they can control, well, the availability of extension services, right? Having some agent from the experiment station or from the local university being able to go out or government and work closely with the farmers, having on-farm field trials, like actually going and showing people what's the benefit, Variety characteristics. This is like specific. What are specific improvements, and then how does this affect the quality of the yields? And then rainfall. Yeah, we'd expect periods of drought or periods of rain is going to be really important, whether or not you're going to try the improved variety. Their policy recommendation is for greater emphasis on farmer participation in the research process and to improve the flow of information between researchers and farmers, which I like because this is exactly the recommendations that we'll draw from the research that I'm interested in, looking at the diffusion of knowledge from experiment stations a century ago in the US and Canada. All right, so this other paper is looking at the importance of improving access to agricultural technology, noting infrequent contact between farmers and extension services, and try to recommend the use of on-farm demonstration and trials to address information problems, right? So if you don't have farmers and extension services, you don't have farmers benefiting from the researchers and from university, and if there's this breakdown in communication, one way to kind of rectify this is let's bring the demonstration to the farmers, and then rather than requiring the farmers to come to the centralized station. Let's see, they learned that farmers are complaining about inaccessibility to seed as the main constraint on adopting improved varieties. Farmers in Western villages report a lack of knowledge as the limiting factor. All right, so in the central area, they're saying, well, we know that these improved varieties are great. We can't get the seed. Farmers in the West say they don't know enough about the improved varieties to consider. Indeed, there's no one-size-fits-all solution. I think that's a lesson from economics in general, but certainly here as well, thinking about all these different regions. We've considered, I think I've mentioned something like half a dozen different countries here with kind of different issues amongst each, and certainly probably within each of those countries, there's different issues, right? All right, so the last part is kind of the reflection. Typically, I would kind of skip to the end and do the discussion questions with the respective paper. For the purposes of this video, I won't do that, but I haven't done it. So, all right, what issues, good or bad, can arise if pineapple farmers actually compare neighbors' experiences with their own? Would you benefit on average this information to be beneficial or harmful? That's really interesting. This kind of depends on which direction we think maybe a biased signal might go, right? Let's then think about the discussion in the context of the developed world. So what's the value of product reviews on the internet, right? So think about product reviews on eBay or Amazon or whatever. So I like to look at more than just the 5-star reviews. I don't like looking at the 1-star reviews because those tend to be people that those tend to be interesting. So what I like looking at, what I think is typically most informative, is to look at like the 2-star and the 3 out of 5-star reviews. Those are the ones that I tend to get the most information from. Also, I try to look at those who have had an experience that I think is going to be similar to what I might experience. All right, so how does the introduction of additional information in the form of kiosks improve outcomes for soy farmers? What do you expect to be the long-run outcomes? Will the market function better or worse in the long run? How would traders respond? So should traders work for a specific quality of produce, or should they try to further reduce transaction costs in some way? There's a series of really interesting things to reflect on relative to that paper. There's some fascinating things there. All right. Lastly, one of my papers, Experiment Associations and Agricultural Innovation. I studied the introduction of a program that used college-trained farmers to conduct experiments in their communities and distribute improved seeds. I showed the presence of these scientifically literate farmers was associated with an effect on agriculture productivity that depended on the quality of information shared by officials. I used examples from over 100 years ago. How might a similar program work in the developed world? This is really interesting, especially like it's interesting to me, but let me talk a little bit about this program. So what was happening was the experiment research station would generate, they had faculty, agronomists that were working on developing improved varieties of seeds. My great-grandfather was one of them. And then they'd have, farmers would send their children to come to the university to study agriculture, right? I mean, today, a lot of people come to the university to study, engineering, science, computer science, business, finance, and so on and so forth. Well, what was really important back then was like agricultural education, because a lot of people went into agriculture and farming. So they send students to the university to learn the new scientific techniques for cultivation. And then typically what would happen is those individuals would go back to their farm. And then lots of times they would work in farming, not exclusively. As you might imagine, a lot of those alums would go into other fields, right? So think about the U.S. economy, transitioning and growing, Canadian economy as well. Well, anyway, so the researchers were saying, wait a minute, we had all these students in class. They learn these things. They might have participated in the experiments here, like doing lab things. These are lab science courses. They've got a tremendous amount of knowledge. We might as well see if we can get their partnership to work with us to be able to extend and continue their education and extend our knowledge. And so what they did is they would work with these students or alums at this point who had gone back, and they'd send them a kit. They'd send them the seeds, and they'd say, hey, look, you do this experiment, report back your results to us. By the way, we trust you to do this well because you came to the university and learned how to do it, and then they report back. And so this is really useful. They expanded the program in a lot of cases to involve those who might have just been hobbyists or had an interest, especially in Ontario. They did that, or those who'd come to the university for a couple of weeks to learn about how to conduct these experiments or learn the latest kind of technology or fertilizer combinations and so on and so forth. And as a result, they're able to do a really good job of being able to test and try new varieties and then subsequently disseminate those varieties throughout the state or throughout the province, as well as being able to learn which varieties do well in particular areas, because you had university trained students who were then saying and reporting the results back and saying, okay, this was our yield under these conditions here. And then, a couple counties over, that was their yields on those conditions over there. And they know things about the soil. And anyway, this is like an important way for researchers to gain a tremendous amount of information. So now the question, how might this work in the developing world today? Right? What lessons can we learn? I think so my answer is I think probably exactly as I've just described could work in the developing world. I also like the idea of this sort of agricultural education, maybe even a more general education being offered, even if it's only for a couple of weeks, like sometimes was the case with these programs for individuals. I mean, I think that the fusion of knowledge and information, education is super important. All right, so it's well known farmers receive a large portion of their income at harvest time. Fertilizer and improved seed would bring great returns, yet farmers tend not to invest in these things. So these series of papers are part of a larger debate. Are farmers suffering from time inconsistent preferences, poor financial institutions, or some combination? I think they're probably time inconsistent preferences. Their present bias is probably no worse than any other humans. Poor financial institutions, though, the environment is worse than what a lot of farmers face, right? Okay, so what's your view based on your own economic and human intuitions on these issues? So pose this question for yourself. Think if you agree with one direction or the other, have other thoughts besides about what could be going on. I think there's just kind of a lot of inefficiency with these farmers being able to have the type of financial system necessary to facilitate savings in a way that's going to confer enough certainty for them to want to do it. I think the voucher program is a really good step. And in general, coming up with ways to promote access to information, improve varieties, and then fertilizer, I think is super important. All right. Lastly, the economics of the organic movement is really fascinating. Here we have an example of how Western consumers' preferences have shifted away from conventional agriculture. I mean, interesting. So we talked about consumers being willing to pay more for pro-socially labeled goods, especially from the standpoint of in the fair trade and the sweatshop lectures, right? The same is true for organic. People are willing to pay a premium for organically produced products, whether or not that label actually speaks to the production process under which those goods were produced. Right? There's this sort of discrepancy between what people believe when they see something labeled as natural or all natural versus how it's actually produced. Organic and the different type of labelings and verification for organics a little bit more stringent, but even so, there's certainly room for fraud but the important thing is people are willing to pay a premium. Now my observation is saying, wait a second, farmers in the developing world who lack access to conventional farming technologies now find themselves actually kind of already doing something pretty close to organic farming, right? So think about it. Before this sort of agricultural revolution and development of fertilizer and all these different things, everybody was doing organic farming. And so looking back at my initial things that I had referenced, where we saw this sort of lack of uptake of fertilizer in sub-Saharan Africa and some other sort of things, suggests actually that some of these farmers might be in a good position to be able to sort of rebrand their crops as organic. And that's actually, I think that's actually interesting to explore. So what do you anticipate would be the long-run equilibrium? Will the large price premium paid for organic produce erode over time? Will it remain will it remain out of practical considerations or because of consumer preferences? This is actually thinking more generally about what we think will happen to organically labeled produce. There's some really interesting economics thinking about organic produce more generally. But anyway, some really interesting things to explore here. All right, I'm going to go ahead and conclude the video. Hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.